My name is Cecilia Patino-Sutton, and I am an associate professor in Department of Population and Public Health. But this seminar is part of a grant that I am part of that is run by the Clinical Translational Science Institute at USC. And I'm the lead together with Steven Siegel in the training program and in workforce development. And these career development seminar series we developed this series to try to cover many of the things that we can't cover in a traditional class that address typical and important barriers to clinical translation of research. And I don't think we can have a more appropriate session than today. I'd like to introduce everyone to Andrew Ibrahim. He's assistant professor of surgery, architecture, and urban planning at the University of Michigan and the co-director for the Center for Healthcare Outcomes and Policy. When I saw Andrew's background, that he's this mixture of a medical profession and then of urban planning, I can't think of a better combination, or at least one of the really cool combinations of backgrounds that can really help clinical translational research go forward. He's going to talk to us about writing for impact and disseminating your research. Andrew, welcome to our series. Thank you so much for coming, and we really look forward to listening to you and interacting with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. I feel obligated, since I'm still in Ann Arbor, to tell you my last visit to LA story. I hadn't seen a number of my friends from medical school in years, and one of them just very generously offered to pick me up from the airport. And I was like, Jeremy, you don't have to do that, but I really appreciate it. So he picks me up and he says, if you don't mind, do you mind if we just make one stop on the way to your hotel? And I said, sure. We ended up at like a grocery store. We got groceries, and he said, do you mind if I just make one more stop? I have to drop some things off to my friend's house. And then finally I was like, Jeremy, I need to go give a talk. Like, I need to be at this place in a half hour. And he goes, I just wanted to thank you so much. If we weren't in the carpool lane, there's no way I could have gotten all these errands done. And he was like, when are you coming back, flying out? I said, Jeremy, don't worry about it.
Oh my gosh. So he was taking advantage of you to be able to use the carpool lane.
Yeah. In fairness, we were like soccer teammates in college. So I think our bond is close enough that like, I definitely fell for the carpool trick. But anyway, I look forward to coming back to LA and not being that person. But I'm excited to be with you guys, at least virtually, from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I will just say one thing to sort of start. I am as motivated and ambitious as anyone. And I think by the people who are like self-selecting on an afternoon to sort of be here, we all love writing papers, taking care of patients, but it's good to somehow just always recalibrate and be kind to yourself. So go to that live music show, go on that hiking trail. For all the good pearls and advice that we'll mentor you on. We probably don't say that enough. So this has just become standard part of slide 2 on all talks now. I am a little bit of a unicorn, I think. So my day job is being a general surgeon. I operate every week and take call every 5th week for emergency general surgery. And that's probably the core of my identity. I'm formally trained as a health services researcher. I co-direct the Center for Healthcare Outcomes and Policy. That's about 75 people total, including 25 investigators and about 25 staff and 25 fellows. We're within an institute that has $1 billion in active health services research funding at Michigan. So needless to say, we take writing and impact super seriously. And I love that photo in the middle at the bottom because it's Friday at 5 p.m. And to just show you that like how big of nerds we are, on like a Friday late afternoon, the room is still full because people want to think about how to scale up their work. And before I did all that, I studied architecture. So I did my foundation coursework at the Bartlett in London. And so you'll see kind of the influence of, I spent a lot of time in studio and a lot of time thinking about design palettes. And I think that actually informs a lot of the way we could communicate our work better. So I'll try to put all of those together kind of in the next hour. There are 2 resources that I'll be referencing throughout this talk. The first one is a guide called Writing for Impact. And it is basically codifying all of our writing tips and tricks and conventions from Michigan that we've kind of stuck to as our cornerstones that I'll share with you, and take as much or as little as you want. But I think it's a pretty good framework to at least start. And then the other is a visual abstract primer. That'll be a guide that if you decide to go down the route of disseminating your work in a visual format, this sort of gives you a roadmap to do it. So I think it's worth mentioning or recognizing that the ability to communicate effectively is a joy and a superpower, but it's also something that you have to consciously develop. It's not just something that you have or you don't, or you sort of think about informally. It is definitely something that needs to be a conscious decision, even for someone as talented as Lin-Manuel Miranda. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about a research paper, and not because you don't know the sections of a research paper, but I want to give you some insight about sort of some of the things that make these sections higher impact, things that matter a lot to reviewers and editors, and things that when you're writing to sort of hone in on. And so the first is the abstract. You know, I used to early in my career I used to do the abstract at the end, almost like the night before, throw it together when the paper was done. And I've actually come to see it in a quite opposite way. And I think it's worth thinking about the abstract as a living document that really has three really different roles. So when you're writing, we often in our group will write the abstract first in a working draft without any numbers. We'll just put blanks in and say, all right, if we did find a difference, like, would this be a good question? Like, would this paper be worth spending 3 months of analysis and time and revisions if the outcomes were this? And what if it was the opposite? Would it still fly? Does it still matter? So we spend a lot of time just with an abstract troubleshooting just to refine our question to make it better. Editors spend a lot of time triaging papers early. And I think if you've been submitting anything in the last year during COVID, or if you've been on the reviewer and editor end, you'll know that the volume of submissions has just gone through the roof. And for better or for worse, at some of the highest impact journals, especially on the clinical side, half of manuscripts get rejected just based on a cover letter and abstract alone. So think about the abstract. This is such a powerful tool. This might be the only thing that gets you even a chance to get your work reviewed. And so it's worth spending a little more time to think about it in such a powerful way. And then finally, you know, I think all of us have this dream that our work's going to get read, that people will actually want to get excited about reading our paper and our research and appreciate the nuances and the detail we tried to dig in into our methods. And so this is like the movie trailer. This is the only chance you might get for a potential reader to really dig in and read the rest of your work. So I kind of shudder in embarrassment at myself early on that this was something I threw together at the end. But I now think about it quite the opposite, as really sort of the essential kind of foot in the door to writing at a high level. At Michigan, we try not to be too prescriptive, but an introduction with 4 paragraphs is too many and 2 is too short. So we really harp on a 3 introduction paragraph. And we sort of follow this playbook that I think a lot of people do. And the first paragraph is just give some context, get the reader up to speed about what is important on the topic. So the Affordable Care Act was passed and allocated X billion dollars to alternative payment models. Whatever it is, your goal is that when someone is reading it, they feel smarter at the end of your paragraph. You don't want someone who's like, I don't know what that means. And gosh, Andrew sounds really smart, but I just feel like he's talking down to me. You want to write this in a tone where people are like, I can get on with this journey. Like, I feel like I'm learning. I want to go to the next paragraph. After you kind of give some context, you want to create some knowledge gaps. You want to make pretty clear what is known and what is unknown, and to set up these curiosity gaps about what really needs to be known about the question. Now, let me tell you kind of the fatal flaw early on that I still get guilty of sometimes. In fact, I did it last week, is you often are writing about a topic that you are so passionate about. You love it so much that in this paragraph, You tell us about 20 knowledge gaps. You're like, there's a million things I wish I knew about how the Affordable Care Act was implemented. But then if you're only going to answer 2 in your paper, like what a buzzkill. Like you just got the reader so excited about this whole world of questions. And you're like, I'm only able to answer 2. So whatever knowledge gaps you introduce in this paragraph should directly mimic the questions that you're going to answer in your paper. And then finally, in the 3rd paragraph, you just preview your plan for how you're going to fill those gaps. It should really work almost like a Jedi mind trick, that as someone starting to read your 3rd paragraph, they've read your knowledge gaps about cost and quality concerns in the Affordable Care Act. And they're just like, gosh, I wish someone would write a paper about cost and quality. And sure enough, in your 3rd paragraph, you say, this study was designed to look at cost and quality of this payment penalty. So we follow this playbook pretty closely. There's maybe a couple examples where you may deviate from 3 paragraphs, but it is a tried and true. And I will say that when I review, I almost look for it. Like I almost look to see, was the writer actually that disciplined to stay this structured in their writing so that I can follow along where they're trying to go. Next is the methods. And I think this is really hard to sort of give generalities about it, but I spent about 1.5 years at Johns Hopkins and got to work with a guy named Dori Segev. If you guys don't know Dori Segev, he is probably one of really the pioneers in transplant surgery. He developed the algorithms by which we allocate organs to make it equitable so that the most people can possibly match. And he ran an incredibly productive and large research group. And when you join the group on the first day, he would famously tell you, you need to read 50 papers from either us or from our group directly or things in the field to learn the tone, the conventions, and the details about how your work is being talked about. And I would say I thought he was really kind of kidding. I'm like, 50 is a lot of papers. But I'll tell you, if you are disciplined enough to do that, you will have such a better time writing this paper and writing it with the norms and conventions that your group and mentors have established for you. When you get to the results section, I don't know if they still use this book in medical school. This was like one of the first ones that we had to buy on day 1, and it was the Bates Guide to Physical Exam. And one of the things that the book just super harps on is that when you're describing a physical exam, just describe what you see in front of you. Don't interpret it. Don't try to make inferences about it. Just say the hemoglobin was 7.6. The skin was jaundice, and you're just candidly describing it. And I think this is one area where, again, you're so excited about the work. You have like a novel finding that you're like so excited. You want to underscore for your readers. You don't want to fall in the trap of something like, much to our surprise, the results shockingly demonstrated no difference between A and B. When you start to do that in your results, it makes you look unbiased and can make the reader really concerned that, man, this person almost made it sound like that's the outcome they wanted, but they're supposed to be objective scientists. This is your chance to really just report objectively the information and say, there is no difference in outcome X between groups A and B, and give the numbers. As obvious or self-evident as this seems to be, I would say with my fellows, and I think I have great fellows who are super talented and disciplined, I probably catch this at least once or twice a week. So it's worth just kind of writing a note to yourself to embrace that. Similarly to the introduction, we have a pretty formulaic discussion that follows a pretty straightforward format. And the first paragraph is just to summarize the findings. If you think about what you've done so far, for someone who's reading this work, you've introduced an abstract, you've given them an introduction, a methods and results. You may be almost 2,000 words in at this point. And for someone to start to like take in your work, you almost need to like summarize and help them catch their breath. So the first paragraph, we always summarize plainly the findings, and it always mirrors what we did previously in the work. So if our first primary outcome was cost, we say our first main finding and say the cost finding. And if the next one was quality, we mirror it in that way. And I remember sitting in a couple editorial board meetings, and somebody will always say something like, I can't quite put my finger on it, but this just doesn't read right. Something about this paper, I can't pinpoint it. And it's almost always that the writer has put things in a different order in different sections of the manuscript, and it no longer follows a parallel format. In contrast, the people who seem to get great reviews, the reviewers will often say something informally, gosh, that just read so nicely. It was just so easy to follow. It's like I almost knew what the next section was going to tell me. A big part of that is being able to keep your writing in parallel format. So after you summarize your key findings, you're going to want to put it in context. This is often 1 or 2 paragraphs. And you don't just want to say other people have tackled this question. You want to add why your work extends or adds something to that work. Now, let me just give you like a very candid tip that wasn't obvious to me initially. This is often where editors will look to find reviewers. When you're writing on a topic and they want to know who else knows a lot about this topic, who else has written a lot about this work, this paragraph is where they pull it out. And so you want to be pretty thoughtful. You can disagree with other people's work, but you want to be pretty thoughtful about how you introduce their work because they very well may be one of your reviewers. Next is you want to explain and recognize your limitations. I think about this kind of like the annoying interview question for a job where they're like, tell us some of your weaknesses. And you say like, one of my weaknesses is that like, I just work so hard because I love my job so much, but I've made it a point to just stay under 20 hours a day of work. And that's been really helpful for me. Just a little humor aside there, what you want to do in this section, you're going to have real limitations to your work. Like in our group, we frequently use Medicare claims data, which is administrative billing data that has some real limitations. And when we talk about it, for every limitation you give, you want to push back and prophylax and say, here's what we tried to do to make it better. So for example, the paper we're writing now, we are looking at neighborhood exposures and the impact of that on some outcomes in Medicare claims. Medicare claims can't really tell you what happens in someone's home. And so it's kind of coarse in that way. But instead of just looking at zip code, we looked at 9-digit zip codes to try to just get a little more granular. And so you want to just show to reviewers and to readers that you sort of made a candid, earnest effort to minimize some of the shortcomings of your work. And then finally, I think this is the most fun paragraph to write. This is sort of like your call to arms. You're like, I've talked you through what the problem was. I've introduced knowledge gaps. I've answered the questions. I've told you why it's important in the context of the other work that's been done. Here's what I want you to do about it. When you finish reading this paper, I want you to get out of your seat and go do these 3 things. And often when I have a junior mentee, especially like a medical student or still a grad student trainee, I often let them write this paragraph because it sort of inspires or connects them to why their work's important before they go back and learn how to code for like 6 months and kind of get in the weeds of administrative data and validating data sets. We often in this paragraph use a paradigm of the 4 Ps: patients, payers, providers, and policymakers. You can use your own, you don't have to stick to those, but it's a helpful kind of brainstorming tool of saying like, who do you want to speak to that you want to get excited about reading your work? Because you guys are in these highly mentored programs, and I love the emphasis that Dr. Sutton said kind of before we started that like, this is about kind of like rapidly moving work forward. It's not about kind of sitting on a question for a year or 2. It's about developing that work quickly. And I think about that also in mentoring your team. So these are kind of in our group, how we think about kind of the 5 components of a research paper, kind of starting with a question, troubleshooting the analysis, developing a narrative, tables and figures, and writing a paper. And, in surgery, I don't know how many surgeons there are in this group. I'll just give you a little insight into our world. There's some really smart artificial intelligence people who've started to map out all the decision trees of what is arguably one of our more straightforward 30-minute operations. removing someone's gallbladder. And when you walk into an OR, we would never expect you to know how to do all this by yourself. It actually takes years to show you how to do this. And we've sort of taken a similar spirit to how we mentor in writing. And so when I have a mentee who doesn't really know the work that well, doesn't really know enough to come up with an authentic question or doesn't know the research enough, I actually pre-bake like 80% of the process for them. And their job really at this point is to write the paper. That is not an easy task, by the way. And that usually takes months of some pretty intensive mentoring. But the goal is to get them to graduate in independence quickly. And I think one mistake that I've seen a lot of investigators make, even in our institution, is they kind of throw the junior person in the deep end at like level 5. And it's like, they don't even know the right question to ask. They don't know how to do the analysis the right way. And so I think being thoughtful, both depending where you are in your learning curve, but also as you take on mentees or students to help you move your work forward, it's good to have some type of process that helps you advance that work in a deliberate way. All right, so that was kind of like the nuts and bolts. I feel like I have to get that out of the way because writing for impact at its core is you need to write and do good work. And I think that is so necessary before you can maybe get to the fun stuff of how to disseminate it. So what I want to do for kind of the back half of this talk is talk to you a little about visual abstracts. I'll give you a little bit of the backstory behind them, how they came to be. I'll tell you a little bit about the impact they've had and how they've taken off. I'll show you some templates and work through some just live examples of how I would create one based on a text abstract, and then give you some considerations moving forward about how it might be adapted or applicable to your work. So what is a visual abstract? A visual abstract is a visual representation of the main findings typically found in the abstract portion of a research article. Now that basically defines like every rule of defining a word by using both of the words in the definition. So it's probably a little better for me just to show you a handful of them. This is one from the New England Journal of Medicine that showed dual versus monotherapy for glioblastoma had no difference in median overall survival. This is a survey from the Annals of Surgery that asked surgeon scientists about their barriers to becoming successful. And the 3 most common reasons were pressure to be clinically productive, excessive administrative duties, and concerns about work-life balance. This is one that was actually just an opinion piece in the Annals of Internal Medicine that looked at common design features between airports that may be relevant to how we design hospitals. And then this is one from the CDC that from their data were able to show 6 out of 10 middle schoolers and 7 out of 10 high schoolers don't get enough sleep. Now, in just a minute, I basically gave you a movie trailer preview of each of those articles. By no means are you an expert on any of those contents. By no means would you read or see that visual abstract and say, I'm going to start prescribing therapies differently. But if you only had time to read one of those articles in 1 minute, you've put yourself in a much better position to identify the work that you care about the most. So I've really started to think about it as sort of this movie trailer or a way to help people who want to read the work identify the articles. So how do you find them? They initially kind of came to life in the social media world. So if you go to any of the major clinical journals, many of them will now have it featured pretty prominently in their work, and you'll see why in a few minutes. The New England Journal of Medicine actually has an entire PubMed database of articles that have visual abstracts. I think they're well over 200 now. JAMA has created a similar database. JAMA has actually gone a step further where they've actually built the visual abstract into the article format. So for any JAMA network paper that has a visual abstract, you'll actually see it now as a drop-down menu on their work. And I'll just say, as someone who like invented this thing, it was a little surreal to see a visual representation of a visual abstract into like the mainstream format of how our work disseminates. And so you can usually find it there. So let me like tell you how this came to be. So I think I mentioned to you in the beginning, I studied architecture and urban planning in London. And this is probably one of the busiest squares in London, that's full of tourists. And if you're there, probably half the people have American accents. And if you look on the road, there's something kind of peculiar. It tells you to look both ways. So in London, traffic is on the opposite side of the road. And if you haven't been there, it may not be immediately obvious that you, when you cross the street, are actually probably looking the wrong way for traffic because it's on the opposite side of the road. And so I remember my British friends kind of making fun of me about this and saying, you know, we really only write this for the Americans. And this was kind of the giveaway that you're in the tourist part of town if you see this on the crosswalk. And I remember just remarking to them once, I said, you know, like, I get it, but like, heaven forbid something should happen and I did get into an accident. Like, we're in London. Like, this is one of the most advanced and sophisticated cities in the world. Surely there's a good city nearby and a good ambulance to get me there, etc. And they kind of chuckled, and I never really understood why until about a decade later. I've gone to med school, and I've gone to surgical training, and I see this article called "The Impact of a Pan-Regional Trauma System and Its Effect on Outcomes in London." And I was like, oh my goodness, London did not have a coordinated trauma system while I was living there. So in fact, when you were there and you got into an accident, you may go to a hospital that had no trauma doctors, or you may show up and they would have no idea you were coming. So I saw this paper and I was like, this is a really big deal. Like, this is really important. So at the time, my mentor was an associate editor at the Annals of Surgery. And I said, Justin, like, we got to blow this up. This is important stuff. And so usually you'll find, if you haven't learned already, that if you're a mentee and you identify a problem, it usually signs you up for work. And so I was given control of the social media account for Annals of Surgery. And I remember just being so excited. And I said, man, I'm just going to tweet this out and everyone's going to read it. So I first tweeted out the text abstract, and 8 people were so compelled by it that they went on to share it with their friends. And about 80 people went to read the article. And I thought, gosh, if only people knew the key points of this article, I bet they would be enticed to go read it. So that became the birth of the first visual abstract that, like, a bit surreal, is now 5 years old and actually kind of like historically archived over my head there. London Trauma, after establishing an inclusive coordinated trauma system, access to a trauma specialist on first survival went from 16 to 84%. Involvement as a senior clinician in the first 30 minutes went from 38 to 92%. And survival for critically ill patients went from 69 to 89%. How could you not read that and like want to read the article? Like, in just a minute, I basically just gave you some really important information. And so I put it to the test. So it did significantly better. Within 2 weeks, this got seen 35,000 times. 170 people went on to share it. And I'm most excited about this. 3 times as many people actually read the articles. And I think about like my work and like how much time we spend on it. Could you imagine an intervention where your work might get read 3 times as often? Like, how powerful. So I told you I'm a formally trained health services researcher, and I just kept reading all these articles, and I said, a lot of these are important. So over the next year, we created over 100 visual abstracts at the Annals of Surgery and sort of saturated the market and kind of made this a normative thing. But although it was self-evident that design mattered, evidence mattered too. So we created this like true nerdiness of like design meets health services academic researcher. We created a prospective randomized crossover trial where we took 44 research articles at the journal. Half got shared as a text abstract.
Oh, there you go. We lost you for a second, your voice.
Oh, am I still there? Okay.
It was
I was just confessing the nerdiness of myself, that it wasn't enough to just be design. It actually had to have evidence. So we created a prospective randomized crossover trial of 44 research articles. Half got shared as a visual abstract, half got shared as text alone. Then we waited a 4-week washout period and then shared them in the opposite format, which allowed us to then do a head-to-head comparison of outcomes match paired to the content of the article. And sure enough, we could actually replicate the findings of our initial visual abstract that articles were seen 8 times more often. The visual abstract was seen 8 times more often, and that articles consistently were read more than almost 3 times as often. And I'll just emphasize, there's really no substitute for reading an article, but the ability to get 3 times as many people to engage your work is powerful. And I think that's maybe the finding of this that I've been most proud of. So we wrote an open source guide for how to do this. We're working on the 5th edition now. And it was kind of a turning point. There were some people on the editorial board who said, this should be proprietary to our journal to attract better articles. And others said, like, this actually seems like it's good for science. If more people can engage accurate scientific work, let's attract them to that work and help them find it. So I ended up going with the latter and open sourced it. We are actually, this isn't updated, we're well over 100 journals who adopted the visual abstract. And there's just a few here, the New England Journal, BMJ, and the CDC. And I think what's been fun for me is we open source the templates to all the journals. And you can see that they held on to the core design ideas of the template, but then made it their own and branded it with their journal and matched it to their content. And this was sort of fun. You start to think like, well, like, how big could this go? So this is pre-COVID. And the CDC, this was their first visual abstract that they created. In 1 week, this report got downloaded almost 14,000 times directly from the link that was attached to the visual abstract. And this was pre-COVID and kind of a little bit of a different era, but they said that that basically matched the downloads that they would get for their like pandemic reports. So kind of wild to think that like one design intervention could get seen 1 million times and lead to wide dissemination of important work. It took on a real global audience. So in Indonesia, they started using it for their annual conferences and actually used it as a way to sort of crowdsource which articles got discussed at the meeting. And I could think, Cochrane Review, if I could think of a group that is the most like rigid between the lines and follow the rules, it's probably the Cochrane Review process. And so to see them embrace the visual abstract and actually teach it in their core methodology was a signal to me that this wasn't just kind of a design aesthetic. This is actually something that's valuable to our practice. It certainly doesn't hurt to get celebrity shout outs. So this was totally unsolicited, but I will say there was definitely an uptick of journals adopting the visual abstract after this tweet went out by Atul Gawande. So what's the secret sauce? So how do you go from this text thing that is a little harder to engage to something in a visual format that really changes the way your work disseminates and travels? So I would love to spend like 2 weeks with you guys in LA, and we could hang out in some pretty cool design studios there to teach you kind of principles of effective design. But let me just harp on a couple that I think you'll resonate with as both readers and scientists that directly inform your work. In the visual abstract primer, some of these are more spelled out, but I'm just going to highlight kind of a few. If you go to any of your friends in the Bay Area who are tech people, you cannot go more than like 30 seconds without hearing user experience. It's just like what they obsess about. It's their thing. And it's worth thinking about that, like in our work. Like, who is the audience that you're trying to target with this visual abstract? Is it scientists? Is it the public? Is it clinicians? So I was thinking about my own work with surgeons, like how would I describe academic surgeons? Like, this is my audience that I'm trying to engage with these academic journals. We're certainly visual people. I mean, we are in a tactile, physical, visual profession. We're technical. We want details. You're not going to kind of give us some high level generics. We want like numbers and p-values and details. And we're busy. So if this thing takes longer to read than the text abstract, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because no one's going to read it. So we actually started, when we started piloting different visual abstracts, we actually started timing people. How long did it take them to read a text abstract? and how long did it take them to read a visual abstract where they could still comprehend the key messages. On average, we found that kind of the average reader could engage a visual abstract in about 6 seconds and knew what the key point was about. Pretty powerful to think about. I mean, there's probably nobody that you engage with, including yourself, who says like, you know, I have tons of extra time on my hands. I'm more than happy to read at like 1/10 the speed that I could. Like, no, like everybody's time crunched. And if there's a way to get your information across 10 times faster, it really matters. Anyone in the audience know where this photo's from? Feel free to unmute for a second if you happen to know. This is in Colorado, at the base of the mountains when you head up to sort of ski up in Breckenridge. And my brother lives out in Colorado, so when I go visit him, we go up and skiing. And he loves driving on this road because it's so effortless. There's no question about where you're supposed to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, you can only go straight. There's almost no cars on it, so there's no real like speed limit. It's so clear exactly where you're supposed to go. A visual abstract should be that clear. It should be so effortless to read across that you never stop or pause or have to go backwards or look up what something means or try to decipher something. It should be so clear, like this road, that you just like enjoy reading through it. So that was one of our principles when we were trying to develop these. So for that visual abstract that I showed you, my office mate at the time was a nephrology fellow. So I said, hey, how would you describe this article in 1 line? And he told me, process, measures, and outcomes of care before and after implementation of a coordinated trauma system in London region for patients experiencing trauma, specifically with an IS score greater than 25. He's not wrong. That's definitely what this paper is about. But which would you rather read? That or London trauma after establishing an inclusive coordinated trauma system? So we spend a lot of time just thinking about like, who's our user? How do we create the clearest message possible to let people know what our work is about? The last one that I love is, this clarity of purpose and really kind of communicating the essence of your work. And some of what we tried to do in the process of developing these is, if you could just summarize your article in like 3 bullets and you told that to someone who knew nothing about your work, would they know what you're talking about? Like, would they get it? If they don't, then those 3 bullets probably aren't quite right. And there's probably more that you need to do. But we kind of use that as one of our litmus tests in building up the text. For those of you who are RBG fans, I recently read her memoir. And I think one of the most striking things about it is how much she obsessed about clarity of writing. And she often was famous for having shorter opinions that just pack the punch. And so she would say often to her clerks, I prefer and continue to aim for opinions that both get it right and keep it tight without any undue digressions or decorations. And I think that's the same spirit in this visual format, and also in your writing. So one of the hidden agendas that have happened at many journals, because the visual abstract disseminated so much, I got to visit the editorial boards of at least about 30 journals in person. And almost all of them said, one of the things we're trying to do is reduce our word limit so that people write in a more concise fashion, because we want them to just get to the key point. They can add an appendix later if they want, but we really need kind of clear and concise work. So let me walk through a little more of the nuts and bolts of a visual abstract to show you how some of these concepts play out. And then I'll kind of walk through and show you how one's created. So at the top, you should be able to summarize kind of the key question being addressed. You want to include where the information came from. So kind of the author and the citation in the journal. And I would just say, I put the logo of the journal there because I was representing the journal. But if you're not representing the journal, do not use the copyrighted logo of the journal because it infers that the journal is signed off on the image. So just be cautious about that. You want to give a summary of the outcomes that has a few components, both stating the outcome, having some visual display, and then backing that with actual data. So let me walk you through how that one was created, kind of just starting from a scratch text abstract. And I think we'll give you a little insight into how those design principles play out. So this is literally PowerPoint with 3 boxes and 2 colors. So clarity of purpose, 2 colors, some boxes, just to create some visual fields. And I go through the article and I literally just copy and paste what's the title and like what's the reference. And then I start to pare it down. This title doesn't actually even fit into the space. And that's kind of a nice thoughtful restraint to try to get you to communicate it more concisely. So instead of that whole mouthful of a title, I reduce that to impact of treating iron deficiency anemia before major abdominal surgery. I read through the article and I pulled out what the 3 major outcomes of the paper were. Like, what are the 3 main points or key things that the authors are trying to communicate? I then went through and found the numbers that support those data points, those messages, and clearly wrote them with their units. But if you were just reading this and you went blood transfusions, 31%, 12%, it's kind of hard to know how to interpret that. That isn't a clear road that you're driving on. You're like, do I turn left? Do I turn right? Like, where am I supposed to go with this? So I then added some directionality to it. So now that one reads, decreased need for blood transfusion, 31% to 12%. It's like so much nicer to read, right? Like, you know exactly where I want you to go. And when we were prototyping these, I would often watch people's eyes. And if I watched them go back a panel or go back up to the top, I knew I didn't do it right. You should be able to go through this and effortlessly move across. And then finally adding images. To me, this is like just an iterative troubleshoot process. These are the ones I started with and kind of realized, I just don't like how those look, and kind of iteratively evolve them. And I thought these were more appropriate. And again, leaning on my neighbors and kind of troubleshooting with focus groups, what would work. And then in kind of OCD fashion, getting things lined up and centered for design aesthetics, not necessary, highly recommended for that coming together. How do you find the icons? A lot of people ask that. There have been icon banks that have popped up. The Noun Project was probably one of the most popular ones early on. But just recently in the last month, this group called Health Icons came out at healthicons.org, and it's free and open source. A bunch of artists basically said, what could be more important than communicating health? And so they basically created all these icons for the purpose of improving health literacy to communicate our work. So I've told you a little bit about how that visual abstract came to be. I've told you a little bit about how journals have used it and kind of some quick nuts and bolts about how you might do it for your own work. I kind of just want to give you sort of the broader perspective or the broader view of how visual abstracts have evolved and how you might think about it applying differently in your work. That hopefully fits in the same mission about how you rapidly bring your work to impact and disseminate your message. So there's no question that it's become part of a formal research curriculum. At our national meetings in surgery, we have career development courses where we teach how to develop a visual abstract. At UNC and their School of Public Health, it's part of their introductory graduate seminar. And at Brown's Medical School, they teach it there as well. So it's definitely taken on a formal role in curricula. But I love the way people have rethought how to use them. So Dr. Greenberg was the president of the Association for Academic Surgery about 4 years ago. And she gave this incredible presidential address about barriers to women advancing in surgery. And everybody in that room was on the edge of their seat for her next key point. And I remember talking to Dr. Chelsea Harris, who was one of the residents there at the time, and she says, I really wish everyone who wasn't here would know how good this talk was and would take the time to listen to it. So she created a visual abstract of the talk, and she took the 6 key findings of the talk and linked it to the YouTube video about 6 months after this talk happened. And you could actually watch the views just rapidly tick up. And it's almost like the talk had been introduced for the first time, because this gave a way for people to identify content they wanted to watch and then go on to watch a 30-minute talk later. This is an example that I love from Atul Gawande. We had asked him during the time of the opioid crisis to write his recommendations or guideposts for opioid stewardship among surgeons. And he wrote these 6 recommendations that we then translated into a visual abstract. And you could see from the time we released it as a visual abstract, within about a day, it got picked up in the lay press public media. And part of what we realized is the reporters who really care about these topics, they can't read our journals clearly, or they may not have access behind the firewalls, but they just want to know these key 3 or 4 points, or they may have never even known about the work had they not seen it in this format. And so very quickly, it was really powerful to see that this article that we all agreed was really good got picked up in major news outlets because the reporters could find it through the visual abstract. It is an easy way to get your work referenced. When these visual abstracts started popping up, I started getting text messages almost daily of people saying, I just saw another visual abstract in someone's slide deck. So then I started asking the people who are making the slide decks, and they said, thank you so much for doing that. That was one less slide that I had to make for my talk. And it made it so much easier for me to talk about that author's work because I had their key points and I had a compelling visual way to communicate it to an audience. So it almost like re-ups the shelf life. There's actually been people who've gone back to articles that are now 3 or 4 years old and resurfaced the importance of their message just by creating the visual to disseminate it. And then lastly, this one threw me for a surprise. So this was the most shared visual abstract at Annals of Surgery, and it was on antibiotic stewardship. Like, I don't know how many surgeons there are on this call, but I promise you that when surgeons get together at the water cooler to talk about anything, antibiotic stewardship is not in our top 5. It's probably not in our top 10. And so I was surprised that this disseminated so far. But I realized when I talked to people about it, this wasn't about antibiotics. This was about practice guidelines. People really resonated because they said, I wasn't going to read a 1,000-word essay about how I should prescribe antibiotics differently. I just want you to tell me what to do differently. And so the idea that we could start communicating practice guidelines so clearly became a powerful way to think like, wait, this isn't just about getting people to read research articles. This could actually change practice. And so there's a group of people who are toying with these visual abstracts strategically as a behavioral intervention and putting them on certain parts of the hospital floor where there's high use of antibiotics inappropriately to say like, could simply putting this one visual actually change people's practice patterns? So let me kind of summarize, bring it home, and then I'll transition things over to take some questions. When you're thinking about visual abstracts in your work, there's definitely a role for disseminating knowledge. And I think it's self-evident. I think resonates with what a lot of us care about. I think the hidden curriculum of it is it actually clarifies your message. When I used to go do visual abstract workshops, I did one at the CDC and had a number of their senior people who, would come with their like cherished article that they said, this is my crown jewel of research that's now 5 years old, but I want to make it into a visual to disseminate it. And after they went through the workshop, they said, now that I've spent so much time trying to make my work clear to a broader audience, I realize that the message in the article isn't exactly what I wanted to emphasize. And I almost wish I could go back to the article and clarify the text to really drive home what I care about. And so the practice of actually translating your work into a visual format is really powerful for just clarifying your message. And then finally, I think I'm excited and intrigued by this idea that these could potentially be a point of intervention, that these, we've seen it at our hospital, start to become the screensavers at some of the nursing stations that start to bring up these practice guidelines or recommendations. And so I think it has a lot of promise beyond just the idea of getting people to read research more. So with that, I will say, if you plan to indulge in this process, I hope you do. But we're in the process of making the 5th edition of this visual abstract primer. So if there are things that you think could be better, things that aren't there that should be there, by all means, please reach out, and we'd love to try to incorporate that in the next edition. So with that, I'll say go blue. I don't think we play USC this year, thankfully. I think you guys would kill us. But if you do come to Ann Arbor, I hope to get to take you to a game sometime. So with that, I will say thank you. And I think we have time to hang out for some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me, Andrew?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Perfect. So I have 2 questions, but I will first ask the audience if they have any questions for you. And I wrote mine in the chat, at least the first 2.
I'll answer your first one while we're waiting, while people are brainstorming. See, Bear's excited, or a dog's walking by. So there is a randomized trial that has not been published yet, but I reviewed it, that gave a group of medical students who came to a free lunch seminar. Half of them got a visual abstract, half of them got a text abstract, and then they fed them pizza for an hour. And then at the end of the hour, they said, hey, can you answer these 3 questions real quick? It relates to that thing that you read an hour ago. And basically showed that the visual abstract people, it wasn't a huge effect, but had slightly better recall of the content. We're able to answer the questions more clearly or more accurately. So small sample size, I think it was like 100 med students or something. But there's at least some promise that it could. I think there's certainly sensitivity to the fact that some people are visual learners and some may not. So some of the most vocal people about visual abstracts were the librarians. They came out in mass and they said, but not everyone's a visual learner. And so they wanted to come up with like auditory abstracts. And I was like, look, I'll bite off the one thing that I can. But just to say that, like, it's not a universal thing, but there's certainly a large group of people who that may be really valuable to.
Great, thank you.
The next question talked about the examples I gave were focused on results. And what about talking about the strengths and limitations of the study? So one iteration that I didn't show in this slide deck is in the more recent visual abstracts. Almost all of them now have like a methods bar, where it'll tell you what type of study it was, the years of the data, what the sample size was, as a way to kind of put some more context into the strength of the study. Was this a randomized trial, or was this just the opinion of 5 people who are content experts, but it's just their opinion? So that has evolved and has been incorporated. There are journals who want to include the limitations in the visual abstract. And I think conceptually at face value, you're just like, yeah, of course, put that in. But one of the problems you run into is there's really only a finite number of words that you can put in a visual abstract to make it effective. If you put too much text on there, you will lose your audience. So there's a trade-off anytime you want to add something. I will say that at New England Journal, JAMA, and the CDC, one of the ways that they are incredibly effective in their process is they have very strict word limits for each section of a visual abstract to sort of have this clarity of purpose and thoughtful restraint about how much you could do. Cynthia asks, would this apply for posters? I've been changing the format of my poster to show the conclusion front and center, then putting the details around the borders. I love it. I love the idea of changing up the poster format. I think the idea that a poster is just going to be like 500 plus words of text and someone's going to sit there for 3 minutes reading is like a little archaic. So at some of our previous meetings, Academy Health really championed this, is for people's talks, they actually made visual abstracts, and it just cycled through the main lobby and changed every minute or so. And so it actually helped people identify what talks they wanted to go to. Like, oh, tomorrow at 4 o'clock is this paper on London trauma and process outcomes. But then they started using it for the poster sessions. And so the poster sessions were an entire virtual screen. So people weren't printing out these massive things that you throw away in the airport on your way back. They actually made it a virtual format, which is certainly more sustainable and environmentally thoughtful. But then when people were just looking at a screen, you could just talk about your punchline for 30 seconds, and then you can talk to people afterwards offline about it. So I think there's still some troubleshooting to do, but I love the idea of integrating it as a way to improve the poster process. Ritu wants to know, can you please repeat the 4 Ps you mentioned for the discussion section? I love that Ritu started with patients, pay. I read it too fast. I thought it said patient and prayers. And I was like, yeah, depending how the writing's going, you might need some prayers to help you out. But patients, payers, so that's like insurance payers, policymakers, and then providers, and providers being like health systems and clinicians who may be engaged in the work. Dr. Berner, thanks for linking the website. I try to put everything on there, and everything's a free PDF open source to download. So you should be able to find anything there that you need. Could you reshare the links with the image icon and the icon banks? Oh, Ritu's all over it. I love it. You guys are like such an engaged, active group. I totally dig it. Someone said agree, huge waste, but I think it was in the context of the posters being printed and thrown away. Hopefully it wasn't about the last hour. I will selfishly interpret it in the way that I want. Dr. Berner has another question about how strictly do you remove jargon? Is the audience lay press, clinician, or scientist? And do you even make multiple versions? What a great question. I think it's worth spending a lot of time thinking about who your target audience is. Because if you're targeting, say, the Centers for Medicare and Medicare Payments, and you start using things like, we need to improve value by evaluating costs, these people are like technical people who are in the weeds of this stuff. They're gonna like laugh you out of the room because they want to know, what are your price standardized risk adjustment total episode payments? And so there's definitely a speech register, if any of you are trained in linguistics, that you want to align with based on your audience. I personally have never made multiple versions of the same visual abstract, but you could certainly imagine creating one that is like patient facing. So there's been talk about adapting these for sort of patient education. We have a student who is brainstorming how to use it in the consent process. We give patients these super archaic 5 pages of dense text from the lawyers. And it's like, why not give them a visual abstract of like, here's the key parts of the procedure, here are the key benefits, here are the key risks, at least as a way to facilitate a better conversation. So I think there's definitely room to change the language depending on the context and the purpose. Claire wants to know if I could comment on clinical versus basic science visual abstracts. So admittedly, almost all my work has been in the clinical and health services research space. The basic science world has taken on a sort of corollary idea that actually kind of pre-existed. That's called like the key figure or the central illustration. That basically is like your conceptual model and sort of highlighting your findings within it. I have not found that to be as compelling, but I think part of it is I don't live in the basic science space. So that may have changed and I'm just not up to speed but I haven't lived in that space enough. Aaron Storms, this is amazing. I'm going to stop reading the question. I'm going to stop there. No, I'm kidding. Let me see what the rest is. I'm wondering if you research. So Aaron has a question about, is it the bullets? Is it the icons? How much do those matter? To just tell you how out of control this has gotten, there is a Delphi panel of like 15 people in 6 countries who are creating criteria by which to evaluate the design integrity of a visual abstract. So I politely said, like, I don't want to be on the committee because that's a lot of meetings, but I'm like eagerly waiting to see. But one of the things they have on there is like, is the icon appropriate? Like, does the icon have like face validity that like it is a like worthwhile or representative of what you're trying to communicate? Let me tell you like a cautionary tale related to that. One of the outcomes in clinical journals we have, especially in surgery, is mortality. 30-day mortality is a key outcome we talk about in surgery all the time. And when you think about like, what is an appropriate icon to represent mortality, it's pretty morbid. And so one person, totally well-meaning, used an icon of, it was basically like a cadaver and like a foot tag and like a tag for a cadaver, which like I immediately saw it and like totally had flashbacks to first year med school and understood what it was getting at. But I got an email from a reader who said, my mother died from that condition that paper was about. And seeing that icon was just so insensitive. And it just occurred to me like, man, that really missed the mark. Like that wasn't even close. Like that really was not only like not helpful, it was like detrimental. And so I think there definitely is some real reasons to think about the icons and their ability and integrity to actually help the work. Let's see if there are more questions. Sometimes the findings, so this is from Claire, sometimes the findings are nuanced. Is oversimplification an issue? For instance, a lot of medical journalism oversimplifies complicated topics to the point of being misleading. Totally agree. This can be like a trap. So I feel pretty strongly that a visual abstract should not be created for every single research article. It just, sometimes the article doesn't translate to this format. I think what you don't want to do is get too far in the weeds where you're kind of like handcuffing yourself to try to be so precise that you're like keeping people away from accessing your work. So there's definitely a balance in there. I think the design world, I don't think anybody would accuse like Apple of being too complicated, but yet an iPhone actually has a lot of nuance and sophistication, but it's actually like super clear. And I think like the holy grail of a good visual abstract is being incredibly clear with clarity, with as much of the important complexity and nuance as possible. But I am not shy at any of the journals where I've done this work, where if an article is too sophisticated or too nuanced or too complicated in its methods, where I think, gosh, trying to put this into a 3-bullet visual format is misleading and could be detrimental, I just decide not to do it. And I think that you should kind of reserve that right in your back pocket to not always do that. Do you see the process of creating infographics as an individual endeavor or a centralized resource for a researcher? So this is a great question, and I think exposes one of the learning curves we had. So when that trial came out that showed articles get read 3 times as often with a visual abstract, what did all the journals do that like got me in trouble? they said, we now require visual abstracts to be submitted for accepted articles.
Oh
And so
no.
then I started getting all this like hate mail that was like, you just added one more thing for me to do, and we didn't even know how to do it. So, but what was worse is the journals required it. So people tried their best, and I gave them my templates. They would create them, and they were not good. They were a number of problems. One, authors had implicit bias and often overstated their own work or presented things more favorably than the actual article. Sometimes they gave punchlines that weren't even related to the work, became like a billboard for them. Two, like, as I think the Lin-Manuel Miranda quote about writing also applies here, it is like a skill. You can't just do one of these. You probably have to do 10 or 12 before you get in some kind of rhythm or tempo about how to do it. And so there are a lot of bad visual abstracts circulating in the world because of that. And so at the larger journals, so New England Journal, JAMA, BMJ, they have a dedicated staff who do this. These are like full-time people who for a living make visual abstracts to disseminate work. That obviously gets done better, but there probably should be some middle ground where we as researchers can advocate for our work and create these at a reasonably high level. And so I've tried to make as much of my resources available to help people develop their work as much as possible. In a pre-COVID world, I probably used to do like an in-person visual abstract seminar like every couple months. And just kind of focus in with research groups about what they're trying to do. So I'm optimistic now that it's become such a thing and so widely adopted that we'll have more formal training to make it a skill that can be replicated effectively. More from Berner. Dr. Berner, is that an argument for not including brief methods? People actually need to read that. People actually need to read the article. So yeah, that's interesting. So the question is like, do you intentionally keep it so short that they have to go read the article to like get it? So like intentionally leave things out so like they have to go. There's some people who took that technique and sort of got accused of sort of like the cliffhangers and like clickbait. And so I've tried to make it at least in, I think the happy medium is that you can read the visual abstract and it stands cohesively together to give you the key points. But it always needs to be emphasized that it's no substitute for reading the article. And frankly, how many of us read just the text abstract of an article without reading the article? Like a lot of us. And I think the visual abstract can definitely communicate just as much information as the text version. Ritu, back in the game. Interesting discussion. Pictures worth 1,000 words. You mentioned Twitter a few times, but I wonder if sites focus on images like Instagram would further engage. Where visual abstracts disseminated the most by far was interestingly Facebook. That was told to me by the CDC, in part because there's just so many people on there. One of the major limitations of Instagram that's probably prevented why visual abstracts have not been adopted there, and that I'm actually happy about, is Instagram intentionally makes it difficult for you to link things in the text. So you actually can't really post a clickable link on an Instagram post. You can only have one link on your profile. And so because of that, I think there was kind of tempered enthusiasm for visual abstracts in that format, because there's sort of been this understanding that like, you're not replacing the article, you're just helping people identify an article that they want to go read. Christina asked, do you think it's worth going back in medical science literature and producing visual abstracts from important past findings, especially for the general public? I love it. Totally. I actually, if I have like a motivated med student or fellow, So I recently took on the role of co-directing this large research group of 75 people, and we get a new crop of fellows every year. And so much of what I want to do in the first 3 months of the year is like, there's so many key foundational papers that I like need you to know. Like, I need you to know these methods. I need you to know these precedents. And at the moment, it's like a PDF folder on a shared drive. And in my like wishful thinking, they all go download every PDF and read them. But I wonder if creating the visual abstract for those articles at least entices them to the article to be like, you know what, I'm writing a paper about price standardized risk adjustment of Medicare claims. And there's a visual abstract for that. And I know the key components. And now I know where the article is to go read to get the rest of the details. So potentially, yes. Speaking of startup, there are at least 2 startups in this space, none of which are mine. And I don't have like any skin in the game or any endorsement of them. But there are at least 2 companies who basically have offered to make visual abstracts for a fee to investigators. And some journals have started to do that as a service that they offer. So there's definitely, I think, a market. I think one of the challenges is like, how do you do that in a cost-effective, reproducible way? Because some of my colleagues asked me if they could pay me to create a visual abstract. And I said, you definitely don't want to pay for 2 hours of a surgeon's time who's also a senior principal in like a global design firm. Like, it wouldn't be worth it, no matter how good your research is. I'm like, you're much better having me spend 2 hours, teach your research group how to do it. And so there's definitely a sweet spot challenge of how to do this in an effective way that would open source it and make it equitable for who adopts it. It just reminded me, going back to someone's earlier question about multiple visual abstracts for the same article. There are definitely many people who've gone on to translate visual abstracts. So take on the same exact one, but present it in 3 languages. And I think that's really powerful for a lot of reasons. But it all still held the same shape and icons and things. So a lot to certainly innovate and prototype in that space.
Okay, I think we're good with the questions. So
thanks, Drew. You guys were so engaged. I really appreciate that.
I want to first thank everyone who came and asked these wonderful questions and made it very, very nice to participate in this session. So thank you everyone for staying and having these amazing questions. And for you, oh my gosh, what a wonderful career development seminar series session. Thank you so much for coming. It was
helpful to you guys.
It was really informative. It was really helpful. But it was also fun. So I always appreciate that.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, let me know if I can do anything to help, and good luck. Hope you disseminate your work, and this gives you some tools to help spread your message.